Every woman remembers the moment when cruel words changed everything. For some, it happens in a school hallway, for others, at a family gathering. But for Ingrid, it happened on her wedding day. She stood before her entire village in her finest dress, ready to begin her new life. Her betrothed looked at her with disgust and announced she was too fat to bear his children, too shameful to carry his name. The words hit like a physical blow. Everyone watched as her dreams crumbled. The feast tables fell silent. Her father's face burned with shame. But sometimes our lowest moments prepare us for something better. A quiet warrior named Sten had been watching from the back of the hall. He had known Ingrid since she was a child. While others saw only her size, he saw her kind heart and gentle spirit. What if the cruelest rejection was actually leading her to true love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Fjord clung to life against the harsh Norwegian coast like barnacles on weathered stone. Winter had settled deep into the bones of the settlement, painting the wooden longhouses with frost that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the pale morning light. Smoke rose from countless hearths, carrying the sense of roasting meat, pine wood, and the ever-present tang of salt from the nearby fjord. In the largest house at the village's heart, Ingrid Eriksdottir knelt beside her mother's cooking fire, carefully arranging stones that had been passed down through 5 generations of women. Each stone bore carved symbols, some for prosperity, others for protection, and the largest for fertility and the blessing of many children. Her mother, Astrid, had taught her that these recipe stones held more than instructions for preparing meals. They carried the wisdom of mothers who had fed their families through winters that claimed the weak and summers that brought both plenty and raiders from across the sea. "The small rune there," Astrid said, pointing to a delicate carving on the corner stone, "that was your great-grandmother's mark." She survived the terrible winter when 3 villages starved. But her family lived because she knew how to make nourishing soup from bones most would throw to the dogs. Ingrid traced the ancient symbol with her fingertip, feeling the weight of expectation that came with being the eldest daughter of Eric the landholder. Her father owned more fertile ground than any man in Ravensfjord, and his longhouse stood as testament to his success. The walls displayed weapons from distant battles, carved wooden bowls filled with silver arm rings, and furs from animals that required both skill and courage to hunt. But prosperity brought its own burdens. As the daughter of wealth, Ingrid had been promised in marriage since her 16th winter to Erik Bjornsson, son of a powerful jarl from the northern settlements. The arrangement made sense to everyone, 2 strong families joining their blood and fortunes, creating alliances that would protect both clans through whatever hardships the future might bring. Ingrid understood the wisdom of such matches, even if her heart sometimes wondered what it might feel like to be chosen for love rather than lineage. At 20 winters, she had watched friends marry for affection and passion, but she also knew that love could fade as quickly as summer flowers, while well-planned alliances endured like the mountains themselves. "You're wool-gathering again," her mother said, with gentle amusement. "Your thoughts drift like clouds before a storm." "I was thinking about the wedding feast," Ingrid replied, which was true enough. The preparations had consumed weeks of planning. Every detail had been arranged with care: the finest meats, imported honey for mead, musicians brought from distant settlements, and gifts prepared for the joining of their families. "Erik Bjornsson will make a good husband," Astrid said, but something in her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as her daughter. "He's strong, his family has wealth and influence, and he'll provide well for you." Ingrid nodded, though she noticed her mother hadn't mentioned love or kindness or any of the qualities that made a marriage more than just a political arrangement. She had met Erik only 3 times during formal visits between their families. He was indeed strong, with the broad shoulders and confident bearing of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. But his eyes held a coldness that made her shiver. and his few conversations with her had focused entirely on the practical aspects of their union: how many children she might bear, how her father's lands would be managed, how their combined wealth could be invested in trading ventures. Still, she had prepared herself to be a good wife. She had learned to manage a large household, to supervise servants, and plan for the needs of many people. She could weave cloth that rivaled the finest imports, prepare feasts that would honor both families, and she understood the delicate negotiations required to maintain peace between strong-willed relatives. The longhouse door opened with a blast of cold air, admitting her father and two of his most trusted men. Eric the landholder was a man who commanded respect through presence rather than bluster, tall and silver-bearded, with eyes that missed nothing and a voice that never needed to rise above normal conversation to be heard and obeyed. "The weather holds fair for tomorrow," he announced, shaking snow from his thick cloak. Eric Bjornsson's party arrived an hour ago and settled in Olaf's house. They brought a fine retinue, 20 men, good horses, and gifts that show proper respect for our family. Ingrid felt her stomach tighten with nervousness. Tomorrow would change everything about her life, carrying her away from this house where she had learned to walk and speak, away from the village where everyone knew her name and temperament, into a new settlement where she would need to prove herself worthy of respect and acceptance. One of her father's companions, a grizzled warrior named Ragnar, stamped his feet to warm them and glanced toward the cooking area where the women worked. "Sten the Quiet was at the docks when the groom's party arrived," he mentioned casually. "Strange to see him taking interest in village affairs. Usually keeps to his own affairs." Ingrid looked up at the mention of Sten, though she tried to appear only mildly curious. Every person in Ravnsfjord knew Sten by sight, if not by reputation. He was perhaps 35 winters old, a man who had appeared in their village 7 years ago with little explanation and even less conversation. He had purchased a modest house on the settlement's edge, kept a small garden, and earned respect through quiet competence rather than boastful stories. What people whispered about was his obvious skill with weapons and his careful, watchful way of moving through the world. Some claimed he had been a warrior of great renown, who had chosen retirement after witnessing too much death. Others suggested he was nobility in exile, living quietly to avoid enemies or political complications. The few times Ingrid had encountered him, at seasonal festivals, or when he brought vegetables to trade, she had noticed how he seemed to see everything while revealing nothing about himself. "Sten pays attention to anything that might affect village security," her father said diplomatically. "A man with his experience understands that celebrations can sometimes attract unwelcome attention from those who might see opportunity in distraction." The conversation moved on to other preparations for the wedding feast. But Ingrid found herself thinking about the quiet man with kind eyes, who always nodded respectfully when their paths crossed, but never pressed for conversation she hadn't offered. There was something peaceful about his presence, a calmness that seemed to settle whatever room he entered. As evening approached, Ingrid helped her mother prepare the final details for tomorrow's celebration. Her wedding dress hung from wooden pegs, cream-colored wool decorated with intricate embroidery in silver thread, a garment that had taken months to complete and represented the finest work of 3 generations of skilled needlewomen. Looking at it now, she felt a mixture of pride and anxiety, knowing that tomorrow she would wear it before the entire village as she spoke vows that would bind her fate to a man she barely knew. "You'll be a good wife," her mother said quietly, following her gaze to the dress. "And in time, affection often grows between husband and wife who treat each other with respect and kindness." Ingrid hoped that would prove true. She had seen marriages that blossomed into deep partnership, and others that remained cold arrangements until death provided release. Everything would depend on the character of the man she was about to wed, and her own ability to build bridges across the distance that seemed to exist between them. Outside, Snow began to fall again, and the wind carried the sound of voices from other longhouses as families prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring changes that could not be undone, carrying her toward a future she could only hope would prove worthy of the dreams she had nurtured in her heart through all the seasons of her growing. Dawn broke grey and cold over Fjord. But inside Eric the landholder's longhouse, warmth blazed from every hearth and oil lamp. The great hall had been transformed overnight into a wedding bower worthy of Jarl's daughter. Tapestries depicting heroic battles and peaceful harvests covered the wooden walls, while tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, imported fruits, and barrels of the finest mead that silver could purchase. Ingrid woke before sunrise, her stomach churning with nervous excitement. Today, she would become Eric Bjornsson's wife, leaving behind her childhood home to begin the great adventure of marriage and motherhood. Her mother and two aunts bustled around her sleeping alcove, helping her bathe in water scented with precious herbs, arranging her hair in the complex braided style of married women, and finally lifting the beautiful wedding dress over her head. The cream-colored wool fell in elegant folds around her fuller figure, and the silver embroidery caught the lamplight like scattered stars. Astrid fastened a belt of worked leather around her daughter's waist, from which hung the keys that would symbolize her authority over her new household. Finally, they placed upon her head a delicate circlet of silver, marking her transition from maiden to wife. "You look beautiful," her mother whispered, though Ingrid caught the slight worry in her eyes. The dress, for all its craftsmanship, could not disguise the fact that Ingrid carried more weight than the fashionable ideal of Norse maidenhood. She had always been rounder than other girls her age, blessed with generous curves that some whispered made her look like a fertility goddess, but others suggested might. Concern a husband hoping for swift movement and easy childbirth, the morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Guests arrived from neighboring settlements, filling the longhouse with conversation and laughter. Eric Bjornsson appeared in his finest clothes, a tunic of deep blue wool decorated with gold thread, leather breeches that showed his strong legs to advantage, and arm rings that proclaimed his wealth and status. He was undeniably handsome in the way that made mothers push their daughters forward and other men step aside with deference. But when his pale blue eyes fell upon Ingrid, something flickered there that made her heart skip with unease rather than joy. His gaze traveled slowly from her carefully arranged hair down to the hem of her dress, and his expression grew increasingly cool with each passing moment. "Eric Bjornsson," her father said formally, approaching with a ceremonial drinking horn carved from the tusk of a walrus. "I present to you my daughter Ingrid Eriksdottir, raised to be worthy of your name and capable of bringing honor to your bloodline." Eric accepted the horn, but did not immediately drink from it as tradition demanded. Instead, he continued studying Ingrid with the calculating expression of a man evaluating livestock at market. The hall gradually grew quiet as people sensed that something was amiss with the ceremony's flow. "Eric the landholder," he finally said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed space, "you have shown me great hospitality, and your reputation for honest dealing is known throughout the northern settlements." Ingrid felt relief wash over her. Perhaps his strange behavior had been merely nervousness, and now he would complete the ritual that would bind them together as husband and wife. However, Eric Bjornsson continued, and that single word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. "I cannot in good conscience proceed with this marriage." The drinking horn slipped from her father's hands and crashed to the wooden floor, where it split into several pieces. The sound seemed to release the breath that every person in the hall had been holding. Whispers began immediately, a susurrus of shock and curiosity that filled the space like wind through dry leaves. "I do not understand," Eric the landholder said slowly, his voice tight with the control required to avoid reaching for his sword. The arrangements were made in good faith, the bride price agreed upon. "What objection could you possibly—" "Look at her," Eric Bjornsson interrupted, gesturing toward Ingrid with dismissive contempt. "Look at the size of her. How can I take such a woman as wife? She is too fat to bear healthy children, too soft to survive the hardships of my northern holdings, too indulgent to manage a household with proper discipline. The words hit Ingrid like physical blows, each one driving the breath from her lungs and the strength from her legs. She felt heat rise in her face as every eye in the hall turned to examine her body with new attention, measuring her against his cruel assessment. Some faces showed sympathy, others barely concealed agreement, and a few displayed the hungry interest of people witnessing unexpected drama. She may have been acceptable as a child, Erik Bjornsson pressed on, apparently enjoying the stunned silence his words had created. But she has grown into something I cannot display proudly or bed with enthusiasm. What would my men think of a Jarl who chose a wife he could barely fit his arms around? What would neighboring leaders say about my judgment and self-control? Astrid made a small sound of distress and moved toward her daughter, but Ingrid stepped back, unable to bear even loving touch in this moment of complete humiliation. Everything she had prepared for, everything she had imagined about her future, crumbled around her like a poorly built wall in a strong wind. Furthermore, the young Jarl continued with merciless precision, I have recently been approached by Olaf Grimsson regarding a marriage alliance with his daughter Sigrid. She is young, slender, proven fertile through her service as a thrall keeper, and her father offers lands that adjoin my own holdings. The practical advantages are simply too significant to ignore. Erik the landholder's face had grown dangerously red, and his hand rested openly on his sword hilt. You dare to insult my daughter and my family before witnesses? You dare to break sacred agreements and bring shame upon my house? I bring truth rather than shame, Erik Bjornsson replied coldly. Better honest words now than years of regret later. I will not saddle myself with a wife whose very appearance proclaims my poor judgment to anyone who sees her. Several of Erik the landholder's men stepped forward, hands on weapons, but their leader raised a restraining gesture. Violence during a wedding feast would bring lasting dishonor to everyone present, and despite his rage, he understood the political implications of bloodshed over a broken betrothal. Ingrid felt the hall spinning around her as if she stood at the center of a whirlpool. Faces blurred together, voices became a meaningless roar, and her carefully constructed world collapsed into chaos and pain. She had prepared for nervousness, for awkwardness, even for initial disappointment in her husband's character. But she had never imagined being rejected so publicly, so cruelly, so completely. Through the haze of her shock, she became aware of movement at the back of the hall. Sten the Quiet had risen from his seat on one of the bench tables and taken a single step forward. His weathered face showed none of the fascination or embarrassment visible on other countenances. Instead, he looked directly at Erik Bjornsson with an expression of cold assessment, as if measuring the young Jarl's worth and finding it seriously lacking. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded hall, and Ingrid saw something in Sten's steady gaze that steadied her own spinning thoughts. Not pity, which would have been unbearable, but quiet anger on her behalf, and a kind of respectful acknowledgement of her dignity that Erik Bjornsson had tried to destroy. Then the moment passed, and Ingrid turned away from all the watching faces, from the wreckage of her wedding feast, from the future that had been stolen away with a few casually cruel words. She walked with as much composure as she could summon toward the hall's entrance, ignoring her mother's calls and her father's attempts to restore order. Behind her, she heard Erik Bjornsson addressing the crowd with smooth confidence. Let this feast continue as a celebration of honest dealing and wise choices. There is no shame in recognizing incompatibility before vows are spoken rather than after. But Ingrid was already pushing through the heavy door into the cold morning air, leaving behind the warmth and light and the life she had thought awaited her. Snow began to fall as she walked, each flake a small cold kiss against her burning cheeks, and she welcomed the winter's bite as distraction from the deeper pain that threatened to consume her entirely. The storage house behind her family's longhouse had always been Ingrid's refuge during childhood troubles, a quiet space filled with barrels of grain, hanging sides of dried meat, and the comforting smells of preserved foods that meant security through the long winter months. Now it became her fortress against a world that had suddenly turned hostile and judgmental. She pulled her heaviest woolen cloak around her shoulders like armor, its thick weave and deep hood creating a barrier between herself and anyone who might approach with unwelcome sympathy or cruel curiosity. The cloak had been her grandmother's, dyed in deep forest green and lined with rabbit fur, substantial enough to hide her body completely when she wrapped it tight around herself. For 3 days after the wedding disaster, Ingrid refused to emerge from the storage house except for the most basic necessities. Her mother brought food that mostly went untouched. Her father attempted conversations that met only silence, and well-meaning neighbors found themselves speaking to a closed door when they came to offer awkward condolences. The village buzzed with gossip like a hive of angry bees. Ingrid could hear fragments of conversation when people passed too close to her hiding place, and every whispered word cut deeper than the last. Always knew she was too big for her britches. If you know what I mean, poor Eric the landholder, all that preparation for nothing. The shame must be eating him alive. Maybe it's better this way. Better to know before the wedding night than after, when it would be too late to do anything about it. I heard Erik Bjornsson is already negotiating with Olaf Grimson's family. That Sigrid is a pretty little thing, thin as a willow branch. Wonder if Ingrid will ever find a husband now. Who wants damaged goods, especially when everyone knows why she was rejected? Each comment felt like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about how the community viewed her and her prospects. She had gone from being Eric the landholder's marriageable daughter to the village's most pitied spinster in the space of a single morning, and the transformation seemed permanent and irreversible. Her father's business dealings suffered immediate consequences. 2 trading partners sent messages, postponing planned ventures, clearly uncomfortable with being associated with a family touched by such public embarrassment. A marriage negotiation for one of her younger cousins was quietly withdrawn. Even the respect that Eric the landholder had earned through decades of fair dealing seemed diminished by his inability to arrange a successful marriage for his eldest daughter. "This will pass," Astrid said on the 4th morning, setting down a bowl of warm porridge that would likely grow cold like all the others. "People's memories are short, and new scandals will soon capture their attention." But Ingrid knew better. In a small community where everyone knew everyone else's business, certain stories became permanent parts of a person's reputation. She would always be the woman who was rejected for being too fat, the bride who wasn't good enough for her betrothed, the daughter who brought shame instead of honor to her family's name. The isolation gave her too much time to think, and her thoughts circled endlessly around the same painful questions. Had Erik Bjornsson been right? Was she really too large to be a proper wife and mother? Had she been deluding herself all these years, thinking she was attractive enough to deserve love and respect? Maybe her failure wasn't just bad luck, but a reflection of some fundamental unworthiness that everyone else could see clearly. On the 5th day, she heard footsteps approaching the storage house, not the familiar gait of her parents or the hurried steps of curious neighbors, but a steady, measured walk that spoke of patience and purpose. A gentle knock came at the door, followed by a voice she recognized but had rarely heard address her directly. "Ingrid, Erik's daughter," Sten the Quiet said through the wooden barrier. "I've brought firewood for the storage house. The nights are growing colder and green wood burns poorly." She remained silent, but he seemed to expect no response. Soon she heard the sounds of someone stacking split logs against the outside wall, working with efficient competence. The activity continued for perhaps an hour, accompanied by no attempts at conversation or demands for acknowledgement. When the work finished, his footsteps retreated. But the next morning, she found that someone had also repaired a loose board in the storage house wall and cleared the snow away from the door. Small acts of practical kindness performed without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. By the seventh day, her self-imposed exile began to feel less like protection and more like another form of punishment. She was allowing Erik Bjornsson's cruel words to control her life just as surely as if he had married her and locked her away in his northern stronghold. The realization sparked the first flicker of anger she had felt since the rejection, not at the villagers or her parents or even her absent betrothed, but at herself for accepting his assessment so completely. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper from the depths of memory, words spoken long ago during another childhood crisis. A woman's worth isn't determined by what men say about her body, child. It's determined by her character, her kindness, her strength in facing trouble. The rest is just opinions, and opinions change like weather. That evening, when her mother brought the daily meal, Ingrid finally spoke. "Tell me honestly," she said without emerging from the cloak's concealing depths. "Do you think Erik Bjornsson was right about me?" Astrid set down the food carefully before answering. "I think Erik Bjornsson is a shallow young man who mistakes cruelty for strength and appearance for character. I think he would have made you miserable in ways that have nothing to do with your size or his. But am I too fat to be a good wife? Too unattractive to deserve love?" "You are exactly as the gods made you," her mother replied firmly. "Strong enough to work hard, smart enough to manage a household, kind enough to earn loyalty and affection. If a man cannot see those qualities because he's distracted by the size of your hips, then he's not worthy of what you have to offer." The words helped, though they couldn't completely heal the wound that Erik Bjornsson's rejection had left. But they reminded her that hiding in shame gave power to people whose opinions might not deserve such influence over her life and happiness. As night fell over Ravnsfjord, Ingrid made a decision. Tomorrow, she would emerge from the storage house and begin the difficult work of rebuilding her life and reputation. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose how to respond to it. She could either remain a victim of one man's cruelty or find ways to prove that his assessment had been both wrong and irrelevant. Outside, snow continued to fall, but someone had left fresh firewood stacked beside the door and cleared a path to the main house. Small kindnesses from an unexpected source, reminding her that not everyone in the village shared Erik Bjornsson's harsh judgment. Perhaps there were still people who saw value in qualities that had nothing to do with the narrow confines of fashionable beauty. The thick cloak remained wrapped around her shoulders, but it no longer felt like a hiding place. Tomorrow she decided it would simply be protection against the cold while she began the work of reclaiming her place in a world that had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a rejected bride. Sten Eriksson had lived 35 winters, and in that time he had learned that the deepest wounds were often invisible to those who hadn't suffered them themselves. As he sat in his modest house on the edge of Ravnsfjord, carefully sharpening his whittling knife on a worn whetstone, his thoughts kept returning to the scene he had witnessed in Erik, the landholder's great hall. The knife was nothing remarkable, a simple tool with a worn wooden handle that fit comfortably in his palm. He had carried it for more than a decade, through campaigns and travels that most villagers could only imagine. But its true value lay not in its steel, but in the patience it had taught him. Whittling required stillness, attention, the willingness to remove only what was unnecessary while preserving everything essential. It was a skill that had served him well in many aspects of life. He set aside the stone and picked up a piece of birchwood, beginning the slow process of transforming it into something beautiful and useful. His hands moved automatically while his mind wandered back 7 years to the day he had first arrived in Ravnsfjord. He had been running then, though he called it retirement. Running from a reputation that had grown too heavy to carry, from expectations that demanded he remain the legendary warrior known throughout Norway as Sten the Steady. That name had been earned through countless battles where his calm presence had turned defeat into victory. His strategic mind had saved hundreds of lives, and his sword arm had dispatched enemies too numerous to count. But legends were prisons as much as honors. Every young warrior wanted to test themselves against his skill. Every Jarl expected him to solve their problems with violence. Every skald wanted to sing new songs about his deeds, never understanding that he had grown weary of death and destruction, that his dreams were haunted by the faces of men he had killed in service to causes that seemed less clear with each passing year. The final straw had been the death of his wife, Helga, during a difficult childbirth while he was away on yet another campaign that seemed vital at the time, but meaningless in retrospect. He had returned to find her cold body and a tiny son who lived only 3 days beyond his mother's death. The child was buried beside her in a grave that held all of Sten's hopes for a different kind of life. After that, the sword felt too heavy in his hand, and the sound of his own war cry made him sick to his stomach. He had given away most of his wealth to Helga's family, kept only enough to purchase a small house in a village far from the great halls where his reputation still echoed, and settled into the quiet life he should have chosen years earlier. Ravnsfjord had accepted him without question, perhaps because his obvious competence with weapons provided security, or perhaps because his reluctance to discuss his past suggested pain that deserved respect rather than curiosity. He had found peace in simple work, tending a garden, repairing tools, helping neighbors with tasks that required steady hands and careful attention, and he had watched Ingrid, Eric's daughter, grow from a gangly 13-year-old into the thoughtful, capable woman who had faced such cruel humiliation a week ago. She had always caught his attention, though he had been careful never to show it inappropriately. Even as a child, she had possessed qualities that spoke to something deep in his experienced heart. While other children played at war games or competed for attention, Ingrid helped elderly neighbors with their heavy work, listened patiently to stories that others found boring, and showed genuine concern for anyone who seemed lonely or troubled. As she grew older, he had noticed her intelligence in the way she asked questions that cut to the heart of complex matters, her kindness in how she treated servants and thralls as people rather than property, and her strength in how she managed responsibilities that would have overwhelmed many men. That she was also beautiful in ways that went far deeper than fashionable slenderness made her rejection by Erik Bjornsson all the more outrageous. The young Jarl had revealed himself to be exactly the kind of shallow, cruel man that Sten had learned to recognize during his years of military service. Such men valued only what enhanced their own status, treated others as tools to be used or discarded, and mistook cruelty for strength. That Erik Bjornsson would reject a woman of Ingrid's quality for such petty reasons said everything about his character and nothing about hers, but Sten understood that logic. Alone could not heal the wound that had been inflicted. Shame was a poison that spread through the spirit like infection through flesh, and it required careful treatment to prevent lasting damage. Direct confrontation would likely make things worse, driving Ingrid deeper into her isolation. What she needed was evidence that her worth was recognized by someone whose opinion mattered, someone who saw her clearly and chose to value what he found. The decision to approach Erik the landholder required more courage than many battles Sten had fought. At least in warfare, the rules were clear and the objectives obvious. This situation demanded delicacy, wisdom, and a willingness to risk rejection himself for the sake of offering something precious a chance to heal. He found the older man in his workshop, attempting to focus on normal activities while his family's reputation hung in uncertainty. Erik the landholder looked up when Sten entered, and something in his expression suggested he welcomed any distraction from his brooding thoughts. "Sten," he said with weary courtesy, "what brings you here?" "I wanted to speak with you about your daughter," Sten replied directly, seeing no benefit in approaching the subject sideways. Erik's face tightened with protective anger. "If you've come to offer sympathy or advice about managing this disaster, I've come to ask permission to court her," Sten interrupted quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a green fire, visible and substantial and impossible to ignore. Erik the landholder stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if he had heard correctly. You want to court Ingrid? Yes. She was just rejected in the most public, humiliating way possible. The entire village is talking about how she's too fat to make a proper wife. And you want to court her? I want to court her because she is intelligent, kind, strong, and beautiful in ways that Erik Bjornsson was too shallow to recognize, Sten said steadily. His blindness doesn't change her worth, though it may have damaged her ability to see that worth herself. Erik leaned back against his workbench, studying Sten with new attention. You're serious about this? Completely serious. But I understand that timing is delicate. She needs time to heal from what happened, and any approach must be careful not to add to her pain. I'm asking your permission to begin slowly, to show her through actions rather than words that she is valued and respected. And if she doesn't return your interest, then I will accept that with grace and continue to respect her from a distance. But I believe she deserves to know that not every man shares Erik Bjornsson's narrow vision of what makes a woman worthy of love. The older man was quiet for a long time, considering implications that went far beyond simple courtship. Finally, he nodded slowly. You have my permission to try, Sten, but carefully, respectfully, and with understanding that she has been badly hurt. If you add to her pain in any way, you'll have my head, and rightly so, Sten finished. I understand. Over the following days, Sten began his careful campaign not to win Ingrid's heart. That would come later, if at all, but to demonstrate that she remained valuable to at least one person whose opinion might matter. He brought firewood and stacked it quietly. He repaired things around her family's property that needed attention. He cleared snow from pathways and fixed loose shutters and performed a dozen small acts of service that required no acknowledgement or thanks. Each piece of wood he carved during the long winter evenings became an offering of sorts. Not gifts to be presented dramatically, but small, beautiful objects left where she might find them and take comfort in the knowledge that someone had spent time creating something lovely with her in mind. A small bird with spread wings, symbolizing freedom from the cage of others' expectations. A delicate flower that would never wilt, representing beauty that endured beyond seasonal changes. He asked for nothing in return, expected no gratitude, demanded no attention. He simply wanted her to know, in ways that didn't require her to risk further hurt, that her worth had not diminished in the eyes of everyone who mattered. The first carved wooden bird appeared on the morning of Ingrid's 10th day of isolation, perched on the windowsill of the storage house, where she would surely notice it when the morning light filtered through the small opening. She discovered it while wrapped in her heavy cloak, prepared to venture out for the first time since her humiliation. The bird was no larger than her palm, crafted from pale birchwood and carved with such delicate skill that each feather seemed ready to catch the wind. Its wings were spread wide as if frozen in the moment of taking flight, and something about its posture spoke of freedom and possibility rather than captivity or fear. She turned it over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship and wondering who might have left such a gift. No one claimed responsibility when she asked her parents, though she noticed her father's slight smile suggested he knew more than he was willing to share. The mystery intrigued her enough to emerge from the storage house and venture toward the main longhouse for the first time in over a week. The village felt different now, charged with whispers and sideways glances that made her skin prickle with self-consciousness. Some neighbors offered sympathetic smiles that felt more pitying than comforting, while others seemed to examine her with the calculating attention usually reserved for livestock at market. But she had made the decision to reclaim her life, and hiding forever would only give Erik Bjornsson's cruelty more power than it deserved. Her mother embraced her with relief that brought tears to both their eyes, and her father nodded approvingly at her emergence from self-imposed exile. The family settled into their normal rhythms gradually, though the weight of recent events hung over them like smoke from a green fire, visible, persistent, impossible to ignore completely. 3 days after finding the wooden bird, Ingrid noticed that someone had been quietly maintaining the area around their property. The path to the well was always clear of snow. Loose fence boards appeared mysteriously repaired, and the woodpile never seemed to diminish despite constant use for cooking and warmth. When she asked her father about these improvements, he mentioned that Sten the Quiet had been helpful with various tasks. He doesn't ask for payment or even acknowledgement, Eric the landholder explained carefully. Just appears when work needs doing and disappears when it's finished. Been doing it for weeks now. The information stirred something unexpected in Ingrid's chest, not romantic interest. Not yet, but gratitude mixed with curiosity about a man who would perform such kindness without seeking recognition. She had always noticed Sten at village gatherings, drawn to his unusual combination of obvious competence and deliberate quietude. While other men boasted about their achievements or competed for attention, he seemed content to listen and observe, speaking only when he had something genuinely worth saying. On a clear morning, when the winter sun painted the snow with silver light, she encountered him directly for the first time since her wedding disaster. She had ventured to the village well to draw water, finding the task therapeutic after so many days of inactivity. Her arms ached pleasantly from the weight of the filled buckets, reminding her that her body was strong and capable regardless of what cruel men might say about its appearance. Sten appeared beside the well, as if materialized from the winter air, carrying his own buckets and moving with the efficient economy of motion she had always noticed about him. He nodded respectfully when their eyes met, but made no move to engage in conversation that might make her uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said quietly, the words emerging before she had fully decided to speak them. He paused in his work, giving her his full attention without the hungry curiosity she had grown to dread from other villagers. "For what?" "The repairs around our property. The cleared paths. My father told me you've been helping without being asked. Work needed doing," he replied simply, as if that explained everything. I had time and tools. Something in his matter-of-fact tone reassured her that he wasn't performing kindness in hopes of reward or recognition. He helped because help was needed, the same way he might patch a roof before rain or bank a fire before sleep. "Still," she said, "it was thoughtful, especially when," she faltered, unsure how to reference the disaster that everyone knew about, but no one discussed directly in her presence. "Especially when you had other concerns occupying your attention," he finished diplomatically, sparing her the need to name her humiliation aloud. Their conversation continued in careful, comfortable increments over the following weeks. Chance encounters at the well or market became opportunities for brief exchanges about weather, village news, or practical matters, requiring no emotional vulnerability from either party. Sten never pressed for more intimacy than she was prepared to offer, never asked questions that might reopen healing wounds, never made her feel that his kindness came with expectations attached. But gradually, she began to look forward to these meetings. His presence had a calming effect that she hadn't experienced with other people since her world had been overturned. When he listened, she felt genuinely heard rather than judged. When he offered observations about village life or seasonal changes, his words carried weight earned through careful consideration rather than empty chatter designed to fill silence. One evening, as winter began its slow retreat toward spring, she found another carved gift. This time, a delicate wooden flower with petals so thin they seemed translucent when held to the light. The craftsmanship surpassed even the flying bird. Speaking of hours spent in patient creation of something beautiful for its own sake, that night she asked her mother about Sten's background, claiming casual curiosity, though they both understood her interest ran deeper than simple neighborly concern. "He appeared about 7 years ago," Astrid explained while they worked together, preparing the evening meal. "Purchased old Gunner's house with silver that suggested he'd been successful in some previous life, but he's never spoken of what that might have been. Some whisper that he was a warrior of great renown who chose retirement, others that he's nobility avoiding political troubles, but he's never confirmed or denied such speculation. What do you think?" I think he's a man who has seen enough of the wider world to appreciate the peace of a small village. His hands show the calluses of someone accustomed to weapons, but they also show the gentleness of someone who has learned to value creation over destruction. The observation resonated with what Ingrid had noticed herself. Sten moved through the world with the watchful awareness of someone trained to violence. But he applied that same careful attention to peaceful pursuits, gardening, carpentry, the patient work of helping neighbors solve practical problems. As the days grew longer and warmer, their conversations grew more personal, though still respectfully cautious. He shared stories of places he had traveled without revealing the circumstances that had taken him there. She talked about books she had read, ideas that fascinated her, dreams that went beyond the traditional expectations of marriage and motherhood. "You think deeply about many things," he observed one afternoon as they walked back from the village market, both carrying supplies for their respective households. "Too deeply. According to some people," she replied with rueful humor. "I've been told that men don't appreciate wives who ask too many questions or have opinions about matters beyond domestic concerns. Then those men are fools who mistake ignorance for virtue," he said with quiet firmness. "Intelligence is a gift to be valued, not hidden away like something shameful." The words warmed her in ways that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. Erik Bjornsson had never shown interest in her thoughts or opinions, treating their brief conversations as necessary formalities before returning to subjects he found more engaging. Sten seemed genuinely curious about her perspectives on everything from village politics to the meaning of old stories told during long winter evenings. One morning she discovered that someone had planted flowers around the storage house where she had spent her darkest days. Not showy blooms that would draw attention, but hardy wildflowers that would thrive with minimal care and provide color throughout the growing season. The placement was too deliberate to be accidental, too thoughtful to be casual kindness. That evening, she approached the well. At the same time she had noticed Sten usually drew water for his household. He was there as expected, working with the same quiet efficiency she had grown to appreciate. "The flowers are beautiful," she said without preamble. "Flowers?" "Around the storage house. The ones that appeared overnight like magic." He paused in his work, and she saw something that might have been embarrassment or pleasure cross his weathered features. "Perhaps someone thought that corner of your family's property could use more beauty." Perhaps someone was right. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, both drawing water and neither feeling compelled to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. Finally, she gathered courage to voice a question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "Why do you do these things? The repairs, the gifts, the kindness. What do you hope to gain?" He considered her question with the same careful attention he gave to everything else, clearly understanding that his answer would matter more than casual conversation. "I hope to gain the knowledge that a woman of exceptional worth understands she is valued by at least one person whose opinion might matter," he said finally. "Beyond that, I hope for nothing except whatever friendship you might be willing to offer." The honesty in his voice, the respect implicit in his words, the absence of demands or expectations, all of it combined to touch something in her heart that had been frozen since her public rejection. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of love. The recognition that perhaps not all men shared Erik Bjornsson's shallow vision of what made a woman worthy of affection and respect. Spring's arrival in Fjord brought longer days, melting snow, and the inevitable gossip that flourished when winter's isolation finally broke. As villagers emerged from their longhouses to tend gardens and repair winter damage, tongues wagged with the accumulated rumors and speculation of the dark months. The growing friendship between Ingrid and Sten had not gone unnoticed, and opinions about their relationship divided the community like a blade splitting wood. Some viewed Sten's attention to the rejected bride as evidence of his good character and practical wisdom. After all, Ingrid remained the daughter of a wealthy landholder, intelligent and capable regardless of her size. Others whispered that even a man of Sten's obvious quality should be able to find an unmarried woman without such public baggage attached to her name. "It's unseemly," declared Ragnhild, the blacksmith's wife, during one of the communal washing sessions at the village stream. "A man of his standing taking up with damaged goods. What does that say about his judgment?" "It says he sees worth where others see only surface appearances," replied Astrid firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone defending her daughter against unfair criticism. "Ingrid is the same woman she was before that fool Erik Bjornsson showed his true colors. But even supportive voices carried undertones of concern. Friends who genuinely cared for Ingrid worried that she might be settling for the first man to show her kindness after her devastating rejection, rather than waiting to see if deeper affection might develop with someone else. Family members questioned whether Sten's interest stemmed from genuine attraction or from pity disguised as nobility. The speculation intensified. When Erik Bjornsson returned to Ravn's fjord for the spring trading season, accompanied by his new bride and a retinue that seemed larger and more heavily armed than necessary for peaceful commerce, Sigrid was everything that Ingrid was not. Slender as a birch sapling, pale and delicate, soft-spoken to the point of near silence. She hung on her husband's arm like an ornament designed to showcase his refined taste and superior judgment. Erik Bjornsson made no direct reference to his broken betrothal, but his very presence served as a reminder of Ingrid's humiliation and a challenge to anyone who might value what he had rejected. He conducted his business with Erik the landholder in tones of exaggerated courtesy that barely concealed his continued contempt, treating the older man like someone who had tried to pass off inferior goods as valuable merchandise. The situation grew more tense when Erik Bjornsson encountered Sten at the village market. The two men had never spoken directly, but everyone present understood the symbolic weight of their meeting. Here was the man who had rejected Ingrid for being unworthy, face to face with the man who seemed to find her worthy of careful courtship. "Sten the Quiet," Erik Bjornsson said loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear clearly. "I understand you've been spending considerable time with Erik the landholder's family lately." "I spend time with many families in this village," Sten replied evenly, his tone giving away nothing of his thoughts or feelings. "It's the nature of small communities that neighbors help neighbors." Of course, the younger man continued with false heartiness. "Though I hear your help has been particularly focused in certain directions. Admirable charity, truly admirable." The word charity hung in the air like the smell of burning meat, impossible to ignore and deeply unpleasant. Several people stopped their shopping to listen more openly, sensing that something significant was happening beneath the surface of polite conversation. Sten studied Erik Bjornsson for a long moment before responding, and something in his stillness reminded observant watchers that this quiet man carried himself like someone accustomed to evaluating threats and responding appropriately. "I find that the most valuable things in life are often overlooked by people who lack the wisdom to recognize quality when they encounter it," he said finally. "Their blindness doesn't diminish the worth of what they fail to appreciate. It only reveals the limitations of their own judgment." The measured words carried such quiet authority that Erik Bjornsson's confident smile faltered slightly. For just a moment, he seemed to recognize that he might be facing a man whose composure masked strength rather than weakness, whose calm suggested confidence rather than timidity. But the moment passed, and Erik Bjornsson's natural arrogance reasserted itself. "Well spoken," he said with forced joviality. "I'm sure you'll find great satisfaction in your charitable endeavors. Not every man has such generous impulses toward the unfortunate." He turned away before Sten could respond, clearly considering himself the victor in their verbal sparring. But those who had witnessed the exchange understood that something more complex had occurred. Sten's quiet dignity had somehow made Erik Bjornsson's cruelty appear petty and defensive rather than clever and superior. Word of the confrontation spread through the village within hours, carrying different interpretations depending on the listener's perspective. Some admired Sten's refusal to be provoked into anger or violence. Others worried that his restraint suggested weakness that Erik Bjornsson might exploit. A few astute observers noted that the quiet man had managed to insult his antagonist's intelligence and character while maintaining perfect politeness, a skill that suggested sophistication earned through experience in situations where words carried as much weight as weapons. The incident weighed heavily on Ingrid's mind as she struggled with the realization that her growing friendship with Sten was attracting scrutiny that neither of them had sought. She found herself questioning whether she had the right to involve him in the complications that seemed to follow her everywhere since her rejection. Perhaps it would be kinder to distance herself before his reputation became entangled with her damaged standing in the community. These doubts were reinforced by a message that arrived 3 days after the market. Confrontation, a scroll delivered by one of Erik Bjornsson's men and addressed to Erik the landholder. Though its contents clearly concerned Ingrid's future, the parchment was expensive, the writing elegant, and the tone formally, threatening in ways that skated carefully along the edges of legal propriety. The message expressed Erik Bjornsson's concern that certain individuals in Ravensfjord might be spreading false information about the circumstances of the broken betrothal. It reminded Erik the landholder that reputation was a fragile thing that could be damaged by association with people of questionable judgment. It suggested that continued business relationships depended on maintaining appropriate standards of conduct and avoiding partnerships that might reflect poorly on all parties involved. Most ominously, it hinted that Erik Bjornsson's new father-in-law commanded significant influence among the northern jarls, and that this influence could be used to support or hinder trading ventures depending on how current situations developed. It's extortion dressed up in legal language, Erik the landholder said grimly after reading the message aloud to his family. He wants to ensure that Ingrid remains unmarried and humiliated, that our family's reputation stays damaged, and that anyone who might challenge his version of events understands the costs of doing so. The scroll represented more than mere words on parchment. It was a weapon designed to isolate Ingrid further and warn potential suitors that supporting her would come with significant political and economic consequences. Erik Bjornsson was using his new connections and influence to extend his cruelty beyond the initial rejection, ensuring that his victim remained trapped in the shame he had created. That evening, Ingrid sat by her family's fire, holding the threatening scroll and contemplating its implications. She understood now that her relationship with Sten was not just a private matter between two adults, but a challenge to Erik Bjornsson's authority and judgment that he would not allow to pass unanswered. The quiet man who had shown her such careful kindness was being drawn into a conflict that could damage his peaceful life and hard-earned standing in the community. The carved wooden bird sat on the table beside her, its spread wings catching the firelight and seeming to flicker with life. She touched it gently, remembering Sten's words about hoping for nothing more than whatever friendship she might be willing to offer. But friendship, she was learning, could be as dangerous as love when it challenged the expectations of powerful men who demanded that their cruelty remain unquestioned. Outside, spring rain drummed against the longhouse walls, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of someone chopping wood with the steady rhythm that had become so familiar and comforting. Even now, with threats gathering like storm clouds, Sten continued his quiet acts of service, refusing to be intimidated by implications or deterred by whispered warnings. The question that kept her awake long into the night was whether she had the right to accept such loyalty when it might cost him everything he had built in his years of peaceful retirement from whatever battles had marked his earlier life. The attack came with the dawn mist, as seasoned raiders knew it should. Ingrid was drawing water from the village well when she heard the first shouts of alarm from the coastal watchposts. The sound cut through the morning quiet like a blade through silk, sharp, urgent, and unmistakably terrifying. "Ships!" came the cry from young Olaf, who had been gathering driftwood along the shore. 3 ships with black sails coming fast with the tide. Within moments, the peaceful village transformed into organized chaos. Men ran for weapons, while women gathered children and began the well-rehearsed evacuation to the fortified storage houses built into the hillside above Ravensfjord. Horns sounded from multiple directions, calling in workers from the fields and fishermen from their boats. Ingrid's heart hammered against her ribs as she dropped her water buckets and ran toward her family's longhouse. Raids were not uncommon along the Norwegian coast, but they had always seemed like distant possibilities rather than immediate threats. Now, with the morning sun glinting off approaching weapons and the sound of foreign war cries carrying across the water, the danger felt as real and sharp as winter ice. She found her parents organizing their household's defenses with the calm efficiency born of long experience. Her father was donning his war gear, while her mother directed servants in moving valuable items to their hiding places. "Go to the hill fort with the other women," Eric the landholder commanded his daughter. "Take the small valuables and help organize supplies for whoever makes it to safety. What about you? I'll fight with the other men to give everyone time to reach safety. Now go, quickly. Every moment we waste in discussion is a moment the raiders gain on us." But as Ingrid moved toward the door, she heard something that made her pause and look back. Her father was speaking urgently to one of his retainers, and his words carried a tone of desperate hope she had never heard from him before. "Find Sten the Quiet," he was saying. "Tell him we need every experienced warrior we can muster. Tell him—" He hesitated, as if considering whether to reveal something significant. "Tell him that Eric the landholder calls upon Sten the Steady to honor old bonds of brotherhood." The name struck Ingrid like a physical blow. Sten the Steady. Even she, sheltered daughter of a peaceful village, knew that name from the songs of skalds and the whispered stories told around winter fires. Sten the Steady, the legendary warrior whose tactical brilliance had saved kingdoms, whose sword arm had never known defeat, whose reputation stretched from the northern ice to the Mediterranean shores. Her quiet friend, the man who carved wooden birds and repaired fences without being asked, was one of the most feared warriors in all the northern lands. The revelation left her stunned and motionless until her mother's sharp voice cut through her shock. "Ingrid, there's no time for standing about. The raiders will be ashore within the hour." She stumbled out of the longhouse and began running toward the hill fort, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had learned. Everything about Sten's careful movements, his watchful awareness, his obvious competence with practical matters, all of it suddenly made sense in the context of a warrior's training applied to peaceful purposes. But there was no time to process the emotional impact of this discovery. The hillside evacuation site buzzed with activity as villagers arrived, carrying whatever valuables they could manage. Children cried while mothers tried to comfort them with false reassurances. Old men who could no longer fight effectively gathered the few weapons available to make a final stand if the defenses below were overrun. From their elevated position, Ingrid could see the 3 raiding ships approaching the beach with predatory confidence. They were large vessels, each carrying perhaps 30 warriors, and their black sails bore symbols that suggested they came from the distant southern territories where raiding was considered both profitable and honorable. She could also see the village men gathering in defensive positions, preparing to sell their lives dearly in hopes of buying time for their families to escape. Her father stood among them, silver-bearded and grim, hefting the sword that had served him well in his younger days. Other familiar faces surrounded him, neighbors and friends who had shared peaceful years, but were now preparing for violence that might claim any or all of them. Then, like a figure stepping out of legend into reality, Sten appeared among the defenders. But this was not the quiet man who had repaired her family's fences and carved wooden gifts with patient hands. This was Sten the Steady, and the transformation was both magnificent and terrifying. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had commanded battlefields across half the known world. His plain work clothes had been replaced by war gear that spoke of wealth and status, a mail shirt that caught the morning light like scales, a helmet decorated with silver inlay, and arm rings that proclaimed victories in conflicts whose names had become the stuff of saga. Most striking was the battle axe that hung from his belt, a weapon that was clearly a masterwork of the smith's art, its blade etched with runes that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Even from a distance, Ingrid could see that this was not merely a tool for warfare, but a symbol of legendary status. The kind of weapon that appeared in stories told by professional storytellers to awestruck audiences. Sten took command of the village defenses with casual authority that the other men accepted without question. His reputation preceded him even here, and warriors who had been preparing for desperate last stands suddenly began moving with the organized efficiency of a professional military force. She watched in fascination and growing fear as he deployed the defenders in positions that transformed random courage into tactical advantage. Archers were placed where they could provide covering fire while remaining protected. The strongest fighters were positioned at key points where they could respond to threats as they developed. Even the youngest and least experienced warriors were given roles that utilized their strengths while minimizing their exposure to unnecessary danger. The raiders hit the beach with confident war cries, expecting to face the usual collection of farmers and fishermen who preferred negotiation to fighting. Instead, they found themselves advancing into carefully prepared killing zones, while disciplined opponents struck at their flanks. And with precision timing, the battle that followed was not the easy slaughter that the raiders had anticipated. Under Sten's leadership, the villagers fought with coordination and tactical awareness that turned their numerical disadvantage into manageable opposition. Warriors who had expected to overwhelm amateur defenders found themselves facing opponents who seemed to anticipate their moves and counter them with professional competence. Ingrid watched the conflict unfold with a mixture of pride and terror, understanding that she was witnessing the legendary Sten the Steady in his natural element. His axe work was a thing of terrible beauty, cutting through enemy formations with strokes that seemed almost casual but left devastation in their wake. When he called tactical orders, they were immediately obeyed by men who recognized the voice of someone who had commanded. Respect through demonstrated excellence rather than inherited authority, but it was not just his individual prowess that made the difference. His ability to see the entire battle as it developed, to anticipate enemy moves and counter them with perfectly timed responses. To inspire ordinary men to fight beyond their normal capabilities, these were the skills that had made him legendary. Throughout the northern world, the tide of battle turned when Sten led a flanking attack that caught the raiders between two forces and broke their cohesion completely. What had begun as a confident assault devolved into confused retreat as surviving enemies fled toward their ships, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades in their haste to escape. As the sounds of combat faded and victory became certain, Ingrid felt her legs give way beneath her. She sat heavily on the rocky ground, overwhelmed by relief and by the complete revision of everything she thought she knew about the man who had been courting her with such patient gentleness, Sten the Steady, the legend whose exploits were sung in great halls throughout the north, the warrior whose tactical genius was studied by ambitious jarls and whose sword arm was feared by enemies across multiple kingdoms. He had been living quietly in their small village, content with simple pleasures and peaceful occupations, and she had never suspected the depths of his concealed identity. The implications crashed over her like cold waves. Why had a man of such fame and accomplishment chosen retirement in an obscure village? What losses or disappointments had driven him to abandon the glorious life that most warriors would kill to achieve? And most importantly, what did it mean that he had chosen to reveal his true nature now, risking the peaceful anonymity he had clearly valued? As the villagers began emerging from their hiding places to celebrate their improbable victory, Ingrid realized that everything about her relationship with Sten would need to be reconsidered in light of this revelation. The quiet man who carved wooden birds was also the legendary warrior whose very name could strike fear into the hearts of seasoned fighters. The wooden bird in her pocket seemed to weigh nothing compared to the massive battle axe that had just carved through enemy formations like a scythe through wheat. Yet somehow, both objects had come from the same hands, created by the same heart that contained depths she was only beginning to fathom. The victory celebration that evening carried an undercurrent of nervous energy, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. The raiders had been defeated decisively, but their unexpected attack had shattered the village's sense of security and raised uncomfortable questions about future threats. Around the great fire in Eric the Landholder's hall, warriors and villagers gathered to share mead and recount the day's events. But their laughter held an edge of hysteria that spoke to how close they had come to disaster. Sten sat quietly at the edge of the celebration, his legendary battle-axe now resting against the wall beside him like a sleeping dragon. The weapon seemed to draw every eye in the hall, its ruined blade catching firelight and reflecting it back in patterns that suggested ancient magic and accumulated power. Children stared at it with wide eyes, while adults whispered stories about the victories it had won and the enemies it had slain. But it was the man himself who commanded the most attention. The revelation of Sten's true identity had transformed him from a respected neighbor into something approaching mythical status among the villagers. Warriors who had fought beside him that morning spoke in awed tones about his tactical brilliance and the casual efficiency with which he had dismantled professional raiders. Even Eric the Landholder, a man not easily impressed, kept glancing towards Sten with expressions that mixed gratitude, respect, and barely concealed curiosity about what had driven such a legend to seek anonymity in their small community. Ingrid watched from across the hall, struggling to reconcile the quiet man who had carved wooden birds with the warrior whose reputation had reached even her sheltered ears through winter tales and traveling songs. The leather bracers on her arms, practical protection she had, donned that morning when it seemed the village might need every able body for its defense, felt like symbols of her own transformation, from passive victim to active participant in her community's survival. She had not fled to the hill fort as commanded. When the fighting began, she had found herself unable to retreat, while others risked their lives for the village's protection. Instead, she had organized the evacuation efforts with calm efficiency, coordinating supplies and medical preparations with skills that surprised even herself. When wounded men were brought back from the fighting, she had helped tend their injuries without flinching from blood or pain. The decision to stay and help rather than hide had felt like breaking free from chains she hadn't realized were binding her. For months, she had allowed Erik Bjornsson's rejection to define her actions and self-perception, accepting the role of damaged goods that others had assigned to her. But facing genuine danger had stripped away those limitations and revealed reserves of strength and competence that had nothing to do with her appearance or marital status. You fought well today, she told Sten when a lull in the celebration finally allowed private conversation. They stood near the hall's entrance, away from the loudest revelers, but still within the warm circle of firelight and community. So did you, he replied, and something in his tone suggested he understood the deeper courage required for her to remain and help, rather than seek safety. Leadership often reveals itself in times of crisis. I'm not a leader. I just did what needed doing. That's exactly what leadership is, he said quietly. The willingness to act when action is needed, regardless of personal risk or social expectations. His words carried weight that had nothing to do with his legendary status and everything to do with the respect she heard in his voice. Throughout the long day of crisis and victory, he had treated her as a capable ally rather than a fragile woman requiring protection. When she had approached with suggestions about organizing medical supplies, He had listened carefully and implemented her ideas without condescension or surprise, but the evening's celebration was interrupted by news that cast shadows over their hard-won victory. A messenger arrived from the coastal watchposts with information that transformed relief into urgent concern. More ships, the breathless young man reported to the assembled crowd. At least 6, maybe 8, sailing under the banner of Erik Bjornsson. They'll reach our waters by tomorrow's dawn. The hall fell silent as the implications became clear. The defeated raiders had not been an isolated threat, but the advance force of a larger invasion. And Erik Bjornsson, the man who had publicly humiliated Ingrid and recently threatened her family with economic warfare, was apparently involved in organizing military action against Ravnsfjord. Erik the landholder rose slowly, his face grim with understanding. He's using the raid as cover for a personal attack. Make it look like random coastal violence while settling scores with people who have displeased him. Sten stood as well, his transformation from quiet neighbor to military commander complete. The raiders we defeated today were probably hired to probe our defenses and create chaos. Tomorrow's attack will be more organized and much larger. We need to prepare for siege warfare rather than another skirmish. Can we hold against that many? Someone called from the crowd. Not with the resources currently available, Sten admitted, with characteristic honesty. We'd need either significant reinforcements or a tactical advantage that levels the numerical disparity. What kind of advantage? Sten was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering options that most of the villagers couldn't even imagine. His years of legendary warfare had taught him to see possibilities that remained invisible to less experienced fighters. We could try to break up their force before it reaches the village, he said finally. Hit them while they're still separated into individual ship crews, before they can organize into a unified assault force. But it would require taking the fight to them, rather than waiting for them to come to us. That's suicide, protested Ragnar, one of Erik the landholder's most experienced warriors. We barely survived today's attack, and that was with defensive advantages. Taking the fight to the water against superior numbers is exactly what they won't expect, Sten interrupted calmly. They're counting on us to be frightened and demoralized after today's raid. They expect to find us hiding behind whatever defenses we can improvise, waiting for the inevitable. They won't be prepared for an aggressive response. The strategy he outlined was audacious to the point of recklessness. Using the village's fishing boats, they would launch night attacks against the approaching fleet, targeting individual ships before they could coordinate their approach. Hit-and-run tactics designed to create confusion and reduce the enemy's numbers before any major engagement. It could work, Erik the landholder said slowly, but we'd be risking everything on a single gamble. If we fail, we die fighting instead of waiting, Sten replied. And we might take enough of them with us to make the victory too costly to be worthwhile. The debate continued through the evening, but gradually consensus emerged around Sten's bold plan. The alternative, waiting, for overwhelming force to arrive and hoping that desperate defense might somehow prevail, offered little chance of success and no opportunity to control the terms of engagement. As the night wore on, practical preparations began in earnest. Weapons were sharpened, boats were prepared for combat use, and volunteers stepped forward for what everyone understood might be a suicide mission. The same men who had fought desperately that morning prepared to risk their lives again, this time in an aggressive gamble that could save their families or doom them all. Ingrid found herself swept up in the preparations, helping organize supplies and coordinate support roles with the same calm efficiency she had discovered during the morning's crisis. But as dawn approached, she realized that her role in the coming battle would be more than logistical. I want to come with you, she told Sten as the war party prepared to board their boats. Absolutely not, he replied immediately. This is a military operation against professional warriors. There's no place for what? For someone who spent today organizing medical care and evacuation procedures. For someone who knows these waters as well as any fisherman. or for someone whose presence might remind Erik Bjornsson that his personal vendetta has dragged innocent people into unnecessary warfare. Sten studied her face carefully, clearly seeing something there that gave him pause. "This isn't about proving yourself, Ingrid. You've already done that." "No," she said firmly, fastening the leather braces more securely around her forearms. "This is about refusing to hide while good people risk their lives, because a cruel man couldn't bear to see me find happiness after he rejected me." Around them, the final preparations continued as dawn approached and the time for decisive action drew near. The battle that had seemed to end with yesterday's victory was actually just beginning, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of Ravensfjord, but the future of everyone brave enough to stand against the forces of cruelty and greed that threatened to destroy their peaceful community. The ancient warning horn carved from a massive aurochs horn had hung in Ravensfjord's watchtower for 3 generations, waiting for the moment when its deep voice would summon the entire community to defend their home. As the first grey light of dawn touched the fjord's waters, that moment finally arrived. The horn's resonant bellow echoed off the surrounding mountains and rolled across the village like thunder, waking anyone who had managed to find sleep during the tense night of preparation. But most of Ravensfjord's defenders were already awake, gathered around their boats in the pre-dawn darkness, making final preparations for what everyone understood might be their last battle. Ingrid stood beside one of the larger fishing vessels, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. The leather braces on her forearms had been reinforced with metal studs that caught the weak morning light, and she carried a short sword that had belonged to her grandfather. Not a legendary weapon like Sten's rune-carved axe, but good honest steel that would serve its purpose when the moment came. Sten moved among the boats with quiet authority, checking weapons and offering last-minute tactical advice to men who had been farmers and fishermen yesterday, but were now warriors preparing for the most important fight of their lives. His presence transformed their desperate gamble into something that felt achievable, his legendary reputation lending weight to their courage. "Remember," he called to the assembled fighters, "we're not trying to sink every ship or kill every enemy. Our goal is to create enough chaos and damage to make them reconsider the cost of their attack. Hit hard, withdraw quickly, and don't let pride or anger keep you engaged longer than tactics require." Erik the landholder stood at the prow of the lead boat, his silver beard braided for battle and his ancient sword reflecting the growing light. Despite his age, he moved with the confidence of someone who had faced death before and found it less frightening than dishonor. His eyes met his daughter's across the water, and she saw pride there that had nothing to do with marriage alliances or social expectations. The enemy fleet appeared as dark shapes against the dawn sky, 8 ships sailing in loose formation toward what they expected to be an easy victory. Erik Bjornsson's banner flew from the lead vessel, a golden bear on a blue field that proclaimed his wealth and status to anyone who might witness his triumph. The ships were larger than typical raiding vessels, built for carrying substantial forces rather than speed and maneuverability. "Now," Sten said quietly, and the village boats pushed away from shore with muffled oars and careful movements, designed to avoid detection until the last possible moment. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would approach from multiple directions, using the morning mist and their superior knowledge of local waters to get close before being spotted. Each boat crew had specific targets and retreat routes planned in advance. The goal was to strike like a sudden storm and vanish before organized retaliation could form. Ingrid's boat, commanded by her father but guided by Sten's tactical expertise, moved through the water with deadly purpose toward Erik Bjornsson's flagship. If they could eliminate or capture the expedition's leader, the entire invasion might collapse into leaderless chaos. The morning mist that often gathered in the fjord provided perfect cover for their approach. The enemy ships loomed larger and larger as they drew near, and individual voices became audible across the water, casual conversation, and boastful predictions about the easy victory that awaited them. "Stay low until I give the signal," Sten murmured to his boat crew. "When we board, focus on creating confusion rather than seeking individual combat. Our advantage disappears the moment they organize their superior numbers." The first attack came from the village's smallest and fastest boat, crewed by young men whose reckless courage more than compensated for their lack of experience. They struck the rearmost enemy ship like a thunderbolt, hurling fire pots and shooting arrows before anyone aboard the target vessel fully understood what was happening. Shouts of alarm echoed across the water as the peaceful morning exploded into violent chaos. More village boats emerged from the mist like sea wolves, each striking at predetermined targets with coordination that caught the invaders completely off guard. Eric Bjornsson's flagship was turning toward the commotion when Sten's boat struck its port side like a battering ram. Grappling hooks flew through the air, lashing the vessels together, and village warriors poured across the gap with war cries that would have made their ancestors proud. Ingrid followed her father and Sten onto the enemy deck, her sword ready and her heart hammering with fear and exhilaration. The deck was crowded with warriors scrambling for weapons and trying to organize defense against an attack they hadn't expected. For crucial moments, confusion reigned as professional fighters struggled to respond to tactics that violated every assumption about how peaceful fishing communities should behave. Sten moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his legendary axe clearing space around him with strokes that seemed almost casual but left devastation in their wake. He wasn't trying to kill every enemy, there were too many for that, but to break their cohesion and create the openings that other village fighters could exploit. Eric, the landholder, fought beside him with grim determination, his aged sword finding targets with the precision of long experience. Father and daughter battled as a team, watching each other's backs and covering tactical openings with coordination that spoke to years of mutual trust and respect. But it was Ingrid herself who provided the morning's most crucial moment of victory. As the deck battle raged around them, she spotted Eric Bjornsson emerging from his cabin in full war gear, shouting orders that were beginning to restore discipline to his scattered forces. He was everything she remembered: handsome, arrogant, supremely confident in his ability to dominate any situation through superior strength and status. Their eyes met across the crowded deck, and for just an instant, the entire battle seemed to pause. Here was the woman he had rejected and humiliated, standing on his flagship with a bloody sword in her hand and defiance blazing in her eyes. The encounter shattered his assumptions about her character as completely as the village attack had shattered his assumptions about their military capabilities. "You," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the surrounding combat. "The fat cow who wasn't worthy of my name. You dare to board my ship and threaten me? I dare to defend my home against a coward who hides behind hired raiders," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "You wanted to see me broken and ashamed. Instead, you find me standing with warriors who value courage over appearance and character over cruelty." The personal confrontation between rejected bride and vindictive suitor drew attention from fighters on both sides, creating a momentary lull in the broader combat. Everyone understood that something significant was happening beyond simple warfare. This was about honor, justice, and the settling of accounts that went far deeper than political or economic conflicts. Eric Bjornsson raised his sword with theatrical flourish, clearly intending to finish what he had started with words and threats. But before he could advance, Sten appeared beside Ingrid like a guardian spirit, his legendary weapon gleaming in the growing daylight. "Your quarrel is with me now," the legendary warrior said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed by kings and jarls. "The lady is under my protection." Around them, the battle continued with renewed intensity as both sides understood that their leader's personal combat would determine not just individual fate, but the outcome of the entire conflict. The morning that had begun with desperate hope was reaching its crucial turning point, where courage and skill would prove more valuable than numbers or wealth. The duel between Sten the Steady and Erik Bjornsson should have been no contest at all. One was a legendary warrior whose tactical genius and sword work had become the stuff of saga. The other was a young jarl whose reputation rested more on inherited wealth and political connections than personal prowess in battle. But pride and desperation could make even overmatched opponents dangerous, and Erik Bjornsson fought with the fury of a man who saw his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Their weapons met in a clash that rang across the water like a bell, drawing the attention of fighters on every ship in the fleet. The legendary rune-carved axe faced a sword of excellent craftsmanship, wielded by a man whose skill, while not legendary, was still considerable by ordinary standards. Sten fought with the controlled precision that had made him famous, each stroke calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste of energy. He was not trying to humiliate his opponent or demonstrate superior skill for the entertainment of watchers. This was simply a problem to be solved efficiently so that more important matters could receive attention. But Erik Bjornsson had other ideas. His initial assault was a whirlwind of aggressive attacks designed to overwhelm through sheer intensity. He understood that his only chance lay in ending the fight quickly, before Sten's superior experience could assert itself through the kind of tactical adjustments that separated legends from merely competent fighters. For several moments, the younger man's strategy seemed to work. His sword work was fast and skillful enough to keep Sten defensive, preventing the legendary warrior from establishing the rhythm and distance that would favor his preferred fighting style. Steel rang against steel in rapid succession as Erik Bjornsson pressed his attack with desperate determination. Ingrid watched the duel with her heart in her throat, understanding that everything depended on its outcome. If Sten fell, the village fighters would lose their tactical advantage and face overwhelming odds. If Erik Bjornsson died or surrendered, his invasion fleet might collapse into leaderless confusion, allowing Ravensfjord to survive despite being outnumbered. But beyond tactical considerations, she realized that she was watching two different philosophies of masculinity clash in mortal combat. Erik Bjornsson represented the cruel strength that measured worth through dominance and treated others as objects to be used or discarded. Sten embodied a different kind of power, strength tempered by wisdom, competence guided by compassion, the ability to protect rather than simply destroy. The tide of their individual combat turned when Erik Bjornsson's aggressive assault began to exhaust itself against Sten's patient defense. The legendary warrior had weathered the storm of initial attacks while studying his opponent's patterns, timing, and preferred combinations. Now, as the younger man's breathing grew labored and his strikes less precise, Sten began his own offensive. The transformation was like watching a master craftsman begin his work. Each stroke of Sten's axe seemed to flow naturally into the next, creating combinations that were both beautiful and terrifying in their efficiency. He wasn't simply trying to land killing blows, but systematically dismantling Erik Bjornsson's defense, creating openings that could be exploited whenever he chose to end the fight. Around them, the broader battle was reaching its own climax. The village fighters had achieved their primary objective of creating chaos and confusion among the invasion fleet, but their numerical disadvantage was beginning to tell. Several boats had been captured or sunk, and wounded men on both sides were falling back from the fighting with injuries that would require immediate attention. The crucial moment came when Erik Bjornsson, desperate and increasingly panicked by his inability to penetrate Sten's defenses, attempted a high, powerful stroke designed to cleave through his opponent's guard by sheer force. It was exactly the kind of opening that experienced fighters learned to create and exploit, and Sten responded with devastating efficiency. His axe swept up to catch Erik Bjornsson's sword at the weakest point of its arc. then twisted with a motion that sent the younger man's weapon spinning away across the deck. Before Erik Bjornsson could recover, Sten's return stroke stopped just short of his throat. The axe blade, resting against his skin with pressure that would draw blood with the slightest additional movement. "Yield," Sten said quietly, his voice carrying clearly despite the surrounding combat. "Order your men to withdraw, and this ends without further bloodshed." For a moment, Erik Bjornsson's face showed the struggle between pride and survival instinct. His entire identity was built around dominance and superiority, and public surrender to the man who had taken his rejected bride represented a humiliation even greater than simple defeat in combat. But the cold steel at his throat provided compelling argument for pragmatism over pride. "I yield," he said loudly enough for both fleets to hear. "All ships withdraw from combat. Return to formation and prepare for departure." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Fighting ceased across the entire fleet as professional warriors recognized the unmistakable sound of command from their ultimate leader. Weapons were lowered, opponents stepped back, and an uneasy calm settled over the water like morning mist. But Sten was not finished. With his axe still at Erik Bjornsson's throat, he addressed the assembled crews in a voice that carried the authority earned through decades of legendary warfare. "You came here believing you would face frightened farmers and fishermen," he called across the water. "Instead, you found warriors willing to die for their homes and families. That should teach you something about the difference between true strength and the illusion of strength that comes from bullying those you believe cannot fight back." He shifted his attention to Erik Bjornsson specifically, though his words remained audible to everyone within hearing distance. "You rejected a woman of exceptional worth because you measured value by appearance rather than character. Then you compounded that cruelty by trying to destroy her family and anyone who might recognize her true qualities. Your actions revealed exactly the kind of man you are: shallow, vindictive, and so insecure in your own worth that you cannot bear to see others find happiness. You denied them." The defeated raider chief's sword lay nearby, its blade etched with symbols that proclaimed his wealth and status. Sten reached down with his free hand and lifted the weapon, examining it briefly before casting it into the fjord's dark waters. The splash seemed to echo with finality as the sword disappeared beneath the surface, carrying with it any pretense that Erik Bjornsson remained a threat worth considering. "Take your ships and your hired killers and sail away," Sten continued. "If you ever return to threaten this village or its people, you will face not just local defenders, but every warrior who has ever served under my command. That is a war you cannot win, and a reputation you cannot afford to challenge." The threat was not empty boasting. Even Erik Bjornsson, for all his arrogance and self-importance, understood that Sten the Steady's network of former comrades and allies stretched across the northern world. Professional warriors who had served under legendary commanders developed loyalties that transcended politics or economics, and that network could be activated with devastating consequences for anyone foolish enough to challenge it. As the defeated invasion fleet began its retreat, Ingrid felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. She had not hidden during the battle or waited for others to determine her fate. Instead, she had stood alongside brave men and women, contributing her own courage to their community's survival. The leather braces on her arms, stained now with spray from combat and marked with small nicks from flying splinters, had become symbols of transformation. She was no longer the woman who had been publicly rejected and humiliated, no longer someone whose worth was measured by others' opinions of her appearance or marriageability. She was Ingrid Eriksdottir, defender of Ravensfjord, partner to the legendary Sten the Steady, and a woman whose character had been tested in fire and found to be strong. 3 months after the battle that had saved Ravensfjord, the village gathered again for a wedding feast. But this celebration bore little resemblance to the elaborate affair that had ended in such devastating humiliation. Instead of imported delicacies and formal ceremonies designed to impress distant relatives, This was an intimate gathering of friends and neighbors who had fought together, bled together and learned to value substance over appearance. The wedding rings that Sten placed on Ingrid's finger were forged from iron taken from the weapons of defeated raiders, simple bands that gleamed with the dark beauty of metal that had been transformed from instruments of destruction into symbols of love and commitment. The village blacksmith had crafted them with special care, incorporating runic symbols for protection, prosperity, and enduring partnership. Ingrid wore a dress of her own choosing, not the elaborate gown that had been meant to showcase her family's wealth, but a simple garment of deep blue wool that complemented her figure rather than trying to disguise it. She had braided wildflowers from Sten's garden into her hair, and her face glowed with contentment that came from deep within, rather than from cosmetics or artificial enhancement. The ceremony itself was conducted by Eric the landholder, acting in his capacity as village elder, and witnessed by every person who had participated in their community's defense. When Sten spoke his vows, his words carried the weight of a man who had traveled the world and chosen to make his final home. Beside this particular woman, I have known the friendship of kings and the respect of legendary warriors, he said, his weathered hands steady as he held hers. I have seen wonders that most people only hear about in stories, and I have owned treasures that could purchase entire villages. But none of those experiences prepared me for the greater treasure of your love and partnership. Ingrid's own vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. You saw worth in me when I could not see it in myself. You offered strength when I felt weak, hope when I felt hopeless, and love when I thought I was unworthy of such gifts. I promise to stand beside you through whatever adventures await us, whether they bring peace or conflict, prosperity or hardship. The feast that followed reflected the village's new understanding of what truly mattered. The food was plentiful but not ostentatious. Fresh fish from the fjord, vegetables from gardens that had been defended with blood, bread baked by women whose courage had helped save their community. The mead was local brewing, rather than expensive imports, but it tasted sweeter for having been shared with people whose loyalty had been tested and proven authentic. Children who had hidden in the hill fort during the battle now played around the feet of warriors who had risked their lives for the village's survival. Old men who had been too frail to fight shared stories with young women who had tended the wounded and organized supplies. The celebration was a genuine community gathering rather than a political display, warmed by affection that came from shared experience and mutual respect. As evening approached and the feast began to wind down, Sten and Ingrid found themselves sitting together beside the great fire, watching their friends and neighbors enjoy the peaceful conclusion to months of uncertainty and fear. Her head rested against his shoulder with comfortable intimacy, and his arm encircled her waist with protective tenderness that spoke of deep contentment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly, gesturing toward the simple celebration that surrounded them. "Giving up the life you could have had, the wealth and fame and respect of powerful men?" "Never," he replied without hesitation. "That life was built on death and destruction, on separating myself from normal human connections, in service to causes that seemed less meaningful with each passing year. This life is built on love and community and the daily work of building something lasting and beautiful." She turned the iron wedding ring on her finger, marveling at how its weight felt both substantial and comfortable. "Eric Bjornsson would say we settled for less than we deserved, that you should have married a jarl's daughter, and I should have accepted whatever husband my father could arrange after my first rejection. Eric Bjornsson understands neither love nor worth," Sten said firmly. "He measures value by appearance and status symbols rather than character and compatibility. His opinion is worth exactly as much as his word of honor, which is to say, nothing at all." The fire crackled between them, casting warm light on faces that had been marked by struggle but were now peaceful with satisfaction. Around them, the village settled into the rhythms of evening. with families calling children home and couples saying goodnight to friends before retiring to private celebrations of their community's survival and prosperity. What comes next? Ingrid asked, though the question held curiosity rather than anxiety. For the first time in her adult life, the future felt like an adventure to be embraced rather than a fate to be endured. We build the life we choose rather than the life others expect, Sten replied. We tend our garden and help our neighbors and raise whatever children the gods send us. We grow old together with the satisfaction that comes from choosing love over convenience, character over appearance, and substance over status. It was not the grand destiny that saga singers celebrated in their songs about legendary heroes and epic adventures. But it was exactly the life that both of them had learned to value above all the wealth and fame that the world might offer. A life built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the daily choice to see worth in each other that went far deeper than superficial concerns. As the last embers of the celebration died down and the newlyweds prepared to retire to their shared home, Ingrid paused to look back at the great hall where her first wedding had ended in such devastating humiliation. That disaster had felt like the end of her world at the time, but it had actually been the beginning of a journey that led her to something far more valuable than the shallow marriage she had originally planned. The woman who had been publicly rejected for being too fat was now the beloved wife of the most respected warrior in the northern lands, not because she had changed her appearance to meet someone else's standards, but because she had found a man wise enough to recognize her true worth. The bride who had fled in shame was now a woman who had proven her courage in battle and her strength in adversity. The iron ring on her finger caught the last flicker of firelight as she walked hand in hand with her husband toward their future, a future that belonged entirely to them, shaped by choices based on love rather than fear, worth rather than appearance, and the understanding that true happiness came from being valued for exactly who you were, rather than who others thought you should become. Behind them, the village of Ravensfjord settled into peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that some stories had endings that were better than anyone had dared to hope for in their darkest moments. And in the small house on the village's edge, two people who had found each other against all odds began the greatest adventure of all, building a life together based on the recognition that the heart sees truths that remain invisible to those who judge only by external appearance. The simple iron rings, forged from defeated enemies' weapons, would never match the elaborate gold bands that marked fashionable marriages in great halls throughout the north. But they carried something far more valuable, the promise that love based on character rather than convenience could transform even the cruelest rejection into the foundation for deeper happiness than those who settled for surface attractions could ever hope to understand.